Testing. Testing, 1, 2. I think it's just, there it is. All right. I got distracted. I was talking. I know that's hard to believe. Well, good evening, everybody. How y'all doing? Good. All right. Glad to hear it. Glad you guys are with us tonight, and hope you have had a good week. So we are going to be jumping into Revelation chapter 17 tonight and looking at some of the more dramatic, symbolic descriptions in Revelation. That says a lot when you realize all that we've read up to this point, but chapter 17 is rich in imagery and lots of dramatic pictures being presented. And so we're going to be looking at that tonight. So if you're watching with us online, I want to give you a very special welcome as well. Glad you are joining us, and hope you will also take your Bibles and open them to Revelation 17. As we've done that, let's begin with a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for tonight, and we are grateful to have your word to look at, to read, and for the Spirit to use to teach us and to shape us and to strengthen us as we walk with Christ. Lord, guide us tonight through these words. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Revelation 17. I'm just going to begin reading in verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name that was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. The angel said to me, "Why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he's Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful." And he said to me, "The waters which you saw when the harlot sits, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman who you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." There you go. He explained everything, didn't he? Yeah, this is one of those passages you're going, I'm not sure the explanation really helped me a whole lot. So we're going to jump into this. And now, obviously, this is a unique chapter. As we have come through chapters 12, 13, and 14, we're kind of a traveling set. And even 15 and 16 kind of were semi-attached to them. Chapter 17, what it's really doing is giving another look at, and this happens several times through Revelation, you get something described, and then later on you have another vision of kind of the same event, but it gives you a more detailed or a more overarching perspective depending on the situation. Now, what we saw at the end of chapter 16, those last few bowls dealt with the judgment of God upon the beast and upon the Antichrist, upon the kingdoms of darkness, the kingdom of the dragon. What chapter 17 is doing is elaborating on that a little bit. So we're not doing something new here. What we're doing is seeing a more detailed description of things that has already been mentioned, especially in chapter 16, but even earlier on, because we have seen at least 3 times now the declaration that God has judged and his wrath has been poured out and is completed. We've seen that idea now a couple different times, only to be followed by something else. But what we realize is that what's happening sometimes is we're having multiple descriptions of the same event. And so you get the same conclusion. Sometimes you get more details or more information about something that's already been declared. So specifically here in chapter 17, we're going back and we're getting more detail and getting more explanation about those last couple of bowls in particular. Let me go back in chapter 16. We have verse 10, you have the fifth of the bowls. The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became darkened, and they gnawed their tongues because of pain. And they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and they did not repent of their deeds. The sixth angel poured out his bowl upon the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so the way would be prepared for the kings. By the way, so we got these kings mentioned here in chapter 17. These things are all interrelated. And then we saw in 13 through 16, we have the beast kind of calling the nations and the kings of the world to prepare for battle against God. And of course, in chapter 17 or verse 17 and following, you have God himself showing up to wage war, and it's implied it's a pretty quick battle. And we just talked about this a little bit. The Battle of Armageddon, which is sort of referred to here in chapter 16, is not a long drawn out battle. Now, if you're like me, I've watched all the Lord of the Rings movies, and you may or may not have watched all those, but if you watch those Lord of the Rings movies, I mean, there's a substantial amount of screen time given to sword play. Massive armies fighting it out, and you never quite know who. Well, you know who's going to win because the movies, the bad guys don't win, but the battles are long and drawn out. That's not the implication here in chapter 16 or in chapter 17. Let me just kind of jump to the end here, chapter 17. There is this verse 14 of chapter 17, there is this war waged against the Lamb. And it just simply says the Lamb will overcome them. And in Greek, it's very quick. It's the implication is this: those who would wage war against God, it's not some long, prolonged, who might win, I don't know what's going to happen type of a thing. God shows up, and that pretty much ends it. There's not a lot of fighting going on. The armies amass, God shows up, thunder, lightning, boom, it's done. And why is it done that way? Why is the battle so quick? Because he's Lord of Lords and King of Kings, period, exclamation point. He shows up, he wins. So understand, this is not a long drawn out who's going to win battle. God shows up, thunder, lightning, boom, done. Because, he's God. So that's the end. But before we get there, let's look at some of these details. So we have one of the angels who had these bowls in chapter 16, shows up and begins speaking and interacting with John. And he says, I'm going to show you the judgment of the great harlot. Now we saw this woman, we've referenced this idea a couple times earlier on, and you may well remember that, especially in the Old Testament, one of the repeating images that God uses, especially in his conversation with Israel, is he portrays their idolatry, their consistent worshiping of other gods, whether it's the Egyptian gods or the Babylonian gods or the Canaanite gods, whatever it might be. He describes those things in terms of spiritual harlotry or spiritual prostitution. One of the more vivid scenes in Scripture in the Old Testament is the book of Hosea. And the book of Hosea is he's a prophet of God who God said, pick out this prostitute over here named Gomer, you marry her, and repeatedly throughout the book of Hosea, Gomer consistently leaves and betrays Hosea, and yet he has to keep going and redeeming her and bringing her back into his home. And of course, the image there is the relationship between God and Israel. And so this picture of prostitution, so to speak, is a picture that God has repeatedly used throughout Scripture. Yes, there's perhaps a vision, an image of sexual sin and immorality there, but really the real message is this idea of faithlessness and rejection of God. That's really the picture here. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this tonight, but I would, these next few chapters are obviously connected. Chapter 19, there is another vision that John will get to. In chapter 17, he's shown the great harlot. In chapter 19, he is shown the bride of Christ. And there is this description and contrast, if you will, seen in these two chapters. If we were reading this or hearing it read some 2,000 years ago, we would catch up on this contrast between the one who is unfaithful to God and the one who is preserved and is faithful and pure as she is beholden to God. And of course, by the way, the church is referred to in the New Testament specifically as the bride of Christ. So there's that contrast. So he says, I want to show you the judgment on this great harlot who sits on many waters. And of course, we saw that explained. We'll get to some of those explanations. Verse 2 describes that this harlot, if you will, has that the kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth, have joined her in immorality. Again, we're not talking about simple physical immorality. We're talking also as much as anything else as idolatry. So verse 3, you see this begin to take place. He just told John what he's going to show him, and now he takes John to this in the Spirit, and he sees this woman, this great harlot, sitting on a scarlet beast. This beast has blasphemous names all over it. It also has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this is obviously imagery we've seen already, talking about the beast and the dragon and the beast there in chapter 13 in particular, chapter 14. So this is imagery we've seen to a certain degree. And he goes on to describe the woman. So we're going to begin here with a description of the woman. It says she's clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. And she has in her hand a golden cup. So if we just stop there, what does the description of this woman kind of indicate? This type of clothing, what's that? She's wealthy, yes. This description is intended to communicate the idea she is incredibly wealthy. These are all signs of richness, if you will, or wealth. Purple and scarlet in particular. Purple was, of course, a color that represented royalty. Scarlet, and by the way, these are the two most expensive colors or dyes, if you will, in that day and age to try to color clothing with. So we know that purple was the color of royalty, or those who were in charge. Scarlet was essentially, that deep red was a signal or a sign of wealth. So these are two colors that are assigned or that are associated with great wealth and great power. If you're walking around in purple and scarlet, you have money and you're in charge of a lot of other things. Obviously, we have the jewelry, and even her cup, even the thing she's holding here, is golden and is full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. So what we have here is great wealth, great prosperity, great power. If we were to go to later on in this chapter, down in verse 15, this woman is also sitting initially on this beast, but she's also on many waters. And he goes and tells us there in verse 15 that these many waters the harlot was on, as well as the beast, signifies all the nations and kings and rulers and peoples and tongues. So the description of this woman is essentially someone or something, if you will, in Babylon, the name she's given in verse 5, with great wealth, great power, and great influence over not just a portion of the world or even just some people, but over everything, over all peoples, over all nations, over all language groups. And on top of that, she has this gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. So she has, this woman is an influence with her great wealth and her great power. And obviously people with wealth and power have a lot of influence, don't they? They have lots of control. They have lots of power, yes, over others in whatever form that may take. And by the way, power doesn't even have to be officially government power. Some of the most influential people in our world who shaped our cultures aren't sitting in Washington, D.C., for example. She's got this gold cup full that represents the immoralities and abominations in the eyes of God. And of course, that's something to drink. It's something to be enticing. If you have something in a gold cup, you're assuming it's probably pretty enticing. So what she's doing and what she holds is attractive to the world, is influential over the world, is filling the world. This is her power and her influence, and even her luring the people of the world into what she believes and what she's doing. And on top of that, in verse 6, this Babylon the Great is drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. We've seen that imagery already before in the previous couple of chapters. As we have seen the description repeatedly throughout Revelation, that one of the things that's happening in this era is that the powers that be, if you will, are making a concerted effort to exterminate and to kill the saints, to kill the people of Christ, to attack God's people. And it's one of those interesting things. On the one hand, God says they will be successful in killing a great many, but it's through their death or through the shed blood that they will, in fact, eventually emerge victorious. But this woman is depicted as being, with this cup, drunk with the blood of the saints. So part of the abominations and part of the immorality is not only idolatry, not even the physical lust of the flesh perhaps, it's also violence, especially violence towards those who would profess Christ and follow the Lord. So these are all things that are depicted as who this woman is in Babylon. Now, okay, we know that Babylon has a couple of different shades of meaning. There is the actual nation of Babylon that existed in the BC era. This was the nation that we first probably associate the name Nebuchadnezzar with in the Old Testament. This was the ones that came in and invaded Israel in the late 600s and early 500s BC, who took captive those like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's that physical nation of Babylon. But in addition to that, Babylon also was used to represent the powers that be, if you will, of the world that opposed God. And the Babylon of John's day, the Babylon of the day of Revelation when it was written, would not have been, of course, the nation of Babylon. It would have been Rome itself. And so, John is writing this under the inspiration of the Spirit in such a way that the people of his day would have clearly, and we're going to see this, all the description of the woman and the beast, all these things are clear, obvious calls for the people of John's day. They would have associated all this with Rome, with the empire, with the Roman Empire, the city of Rome. So Babylon is this, it's not so much, it's a world philosophy and power and approach and mentality and culture and idea that is rebellion to God, that could be seen in the Babylonian Empire. Egypt is thrown in there sometimes with it, and Rome is definitely wrapped up in it. It's that world idea, world power that revels in the abominations towards God, who will ultimately be violent towards God's people, who are not only engaged in sexual immorality perhaps, but even more so have engaged in idolatry to the sense that they have denied God, they have rebelled against God, they are faithless towards God. That's who Babylon is, and that gives rise to everything else. So she is in one sense that nation, but she's also in another sense that spirit, if you will, of the nation of Babylon, that spirit of Rome. And understand that in the first century, where the early church is at, Rome, the emperors of Rome declare themselves to be deities. They demand to worship. The Caesars are called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's one of their titles. So when you see those titles, for example, at the end of chapter 17 here, that's a very clear shot to the Roman emperors. So this is all tied up in that. Now, obviously, this is a very graphic description of Babylon / to be Rome. In case I don't know what our images of Rome, ancient Rome, are, and none of us have obviously lived, that long. But some of you may have heard of a guy named Seneca. Seneca in history was a Roman philosopher, writer. He's fairly well known in modern day times. And Seneca wrote in the middle of the first century about Rome. And here's his two-word description of Rome as a city and as an empire. Seneca said that Rome was, quote, a filthy sewer. Now, he was referring to the culture, not, drainage. Tacitus is considered by many people today the great, we may have heard of from certain Roman historians. Tacitus wrote in the middle and later half of the first century AD much of Roman history. We have some of his writings. He's considered by modern day scholars, many of them, to be the greatest of the Roman historians. He describes Rome in this way. He said, Rome is where all the horrible and shameful things of the world congregate and find a home. These are two of the premier historical thinkers and writers of that first century, speaking of their own capital. So it gives us an idea of what Rome was like. I'll let you fill in any modern day descriptions you want to on your own, but that's what they have described Rome as. So if you are in the early church and you're hearing a description like this, you're thinking Rome. It's very clearly, and the culture and the worldview and the faith, and really all that goes with that. Now, this great harlot with that name on her forehead, we've talked about that in the past, who's drunk with the blood, is sitting on this scarlet beast. Now, obviously, a while ago she was on the waters, now she's on a scarlet beast. Remember, these are visions moving around, so don't get too literal with everything. These are just visions that John is getting of heavenly realities behind what we see physically. And so this beast, which is also scarlet, has 7 heads and 10 horns. And in verse 8, he begins describing this beast as the one who was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss. Now, what's he referring to? Was and is not, and then is about to come up. You may remember that in chapter 13, one of the things that happens in 13 is the beast himself will do things to imitate. We also call it the beast, the Antichrist. And in chapter 13, verse 3, we saw this description of the beast, that I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. The idea, I think, here in chapter 17 is it's a reference to that. It's a reference to the apparent death and then disappearance and then the return or of a resurrection. This is an attempt by the Antichrist to imitate the actions of Jesus Christ. And this has been one of the things we've seen throughout Revelation is that there is a constant attempt by Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet to imitate and to do things that appear to make them look divine and godlike, to be worthy of the worship of the world, to seduce the world, if you will, into idolatry, or to at least turn away from Christ, to turn away from God. This is part of that. I think this is what this verse is referring to here in verse 8. So the beast that you saw was, is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and then go to destruction. So there's going to be this fake resurrection, if you will. Every time the beast is talked about or the dragon talks about, coming up. You get this coming out of the abyss thing on a regular basis. And they come up out of the abyss, and those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. In other words, this fake resurrection, and we saw, again, this goes back to chapter 13, that imitation, those miracles, if you will, that are tempted by the beast and the dragon, the Antichrist in chapter 13, are meant to deceive the world, to turn away from God and to turn towards them. So this is what's happening here. It's a description of the same event we saw there in chapter 13. And their goal is to deceive. Satan's goal is always to deceive. You may remember in chapter 13, we saw the number of the beast revealed. And before that it said, he who is wise will pay attention to this. We have that same thing here in verse 9. So here's the mind who has wisdom. And then he goes into a description. One of the things that God's telling us here in Revelation is this. All these things are happening. We're afraid of Christians today, we read Revelation and we're amazed, and we're even afraid of all the bowls and all the trumpets and all the seals, and we're frightened by all those things. And I get that. They don't sound real pleasant to live through. But what Revelation is actually constantly telling us is this: if you're one of God's people, what you have to be worried about is not the hailstones or not water turned to blood. You need to be wise. You need to make sure you're approaching these events with God's wisdom so that you will not be deceived. Revelation is not primarily about trying to predict what nationality the Antichrist may be. It's not trying to figure out what date all these things are going to take place. What Revelation is doing is trying to give us cues and signals to recognize the truth of God versus the deceit of Satan. So that as these things, and whether they are the ultimate end-time events or whether they are similar events that take place, because we've seen this too, and we're going to see this again even tonight. There have been waves of persecution throughout the last 2,000 years of history against Christian believers. There have been waves of governments who act and do things described by God in Revelations 12 and 14. I mean, we have seen persecution. We have seen murders. We have seen deception. We have seen idolatry repeatedly. And we've seen even these ideas that you can't trust God, you should trust us. We've seen governments and nations and cultures pressure people to turn away from the truth of God and to turn towards the things talked about in Revelation. So whether you are in the middle of that in 1948 or this year or whenever these events actually do ultimately fulfill the last time, what God is telling us, He's trying to get us to understand is this: see through the lies. Don't be deceived. Recognize deception when it shows up. Because to bring everything full circle, we are in Revelation. So let's go back to where everything began. How did things get into trouble? What happened? It didn't begin with the eating of a piece of fruit. It began with deception. It began with lies. It began with the one called the serpent in Genesis 1, called the dragon in Revelation. Same guy, deceiving people, getting them to believe, in the serpent's case, that he's the one worth trusting, not the God who gave them breath, not God himself. So this is all full circle. Actually, that was a little tangent I had for the end, but you got it early. It's all right, because it really is the point here. So this beast is trying to deceive by being who was and is not. He's going to come out of the abyss. But he's on his way to doing what? He's on his way to destruction. Along with those who have marveled wow, that guy, they're not going to call him the beast necessarily. I'm pretty sure it's not his nickname. But that Antichrist figure, the world will find themselves taken with him. Can't look away. Look at what he's done. He has to be the real thing. And he will capture the world's attention and capture the world's wonder and awe and amazement, except for those who are approaching this with the wisdom of God. Here's some wisdom, he says. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. So these 7 heads have 2 different representations here of what they mean. First of all, there are 7 mountains. Now, this is basically saying Rome without spelling the word Rome. Rome was known as the city of 7 hills. It's built on 7 mountains or hills, and it was known as that from hundreds of years before this. So that is about as obvious a description of Rome as you can get. So he says the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So now she's been sitting on water, she's sitting on the beast, now she's sitting, on these 7 mountains. Again, these images are we don't have to hold hard and fast to these specific images. We're just getting glimpses and pictures and things. This is how the apocalyptic literature works. So she's in Rome. She's Rome. And there's 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. So that cleared it up, didn't it? It's 7 mountains. Oh, yeah, 7 kings. By the way, 5 of them are gone. 1's here now. 1 is yet to come. And by the way, the beast is one of them, but he's also number 8. So what in the world is going on here? I'm glad you asked that question, because I have not a real good idea. But I'm in good company. This is one of those things, I read so many things, and this, again, that's not new. There are portions of Revelation to which there's portions of Revelation that the majority of people kind of, okay, we feel pretty good about this. This is one of those verses that if you have 100 Greek Revelation scholars in a room, you're going to get 95 opinions. There's just no consensus. Part of it is that at face value would indicate, if we get the city of Rome here, that there would be 5 emperors, perhaps. There's a current emperor and there's one yet to come. And that makes perfect sense until you realize it's been 2,000 years and there were lots of Roman emperors, more than 7, more than 8 for that matter. In fact, by the time I believe that Revelation was written in the 90s AD, there had already been about 8 or 9 Roman emperors. So what's he talking about here? Maybe he picked out 7. Now 7, of course, is a number we know means this idea of completion and wholeness, perfection, maturity. It may just simply be saying that what he's doing is simply this. There is going to be a time when all this is done, when the rulers of this world, the rulers of Babylon, the rulers of the great Babylon or Rome, when the ruling is complete and that last king is there. That's possible. There are some who want to name 5 emperors and hope that the 7th one is just one that we don't know who it is. Again, if you're in the 60s AD or even the 90s AD, there's another 300 years of the former Roman Empire with emperors yet to go. So it's hard to pick out which one. So if you're going to take that route, have fun deciding which of the 6 or 7 Roman emperors over 400 years, 500 years, you want to pick. So I don't think that's where I want to go. I think I'm going to stick with the idea that this is a symbolic thing, and that the one who is to come, and where we really want to focus upon this for our purposes anyway, I mean, the reality is for you and I, who the first five were don't really matter. We don't know who they were. We don't know which five he's talking about. And the reality is they've gone a long time ago. So if we're looking to the future, who they were probably does not, in the end, matter all that much. What we're primarily concerned with is the one who has not yet come and who is going to come. And when he comes, he's going to be here for a little while. Now, what's he talking about here? These kings. I think the idea of what he's talking about here is this. There's going to be one who's going to come in and be like a Roman emperor. He's going to reign, he's going to rule in that sense. If you were to look at him, if you were in John's day, you knew what it was to live under a Roman emperor. You knew what that was like, to have someone up there with absolute power. And there's going to be someone like that at some point down the line who has incredible influence over some type of an empire and who will be allied with other nations of the earth. It's not necessarily a worldwide empire with one guy, but he's going to be a superpower of some sort, and he's going to get others into with him. He's going to be somebody of great influence, someone who the world by and large can't take their eyes off of. And this is who he's going to be. Now, he's on his way to destruction, by the way. Ultimately that's what you're concerned about, right? He's on his way to be destroyed. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 other kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they will receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. And they have one purpose: they give their power and authority to the beast. So the idea is that there's these 10 other kings out there who will ally themselves with the beast or with this one king. Now again, there has been a lot of speculation about who are these 10 kings, what nations do they represent. Again, 30-something years ago, and this is just all from memory, so I may be wrong. I remember at one point what we call the European Common Market, when it first began, had 10 nations in it. So it was not uncommon when I was in high school to hear that there was going to be some kind of a Romanesque emperor making an alliance with a European Common Market. That's where the Antichrist was going to be. Of course, now the European Common Market's got like 20-something, 30-something nations in it, so that kind of those books are no longer being read. The point is, I don't think we're trying to figure out what country the beast comes from or what country these kings are coming from. If you are in John's day, if you take the picture we looked there in chapter 16 of the Euphrates drying up, opening the eastern edges of what was in the Roman Empire up for invasion from a group called the Parthians, that was always the scary part of the Roman Empire. They would have seen that as a threat. They would have seen that as, our nation's falling because of those people out east on the other side of the Euphrates. So if the Euphrates dries up, that's the end of the world. That's an image that would have popped into their mind as they understood it. Well, we have this idea that these 10 kings are going to ally themselves with the beast. So whoever these people are, you're going to see the beast consolidating power. And the reason God says these 10 kings have some power is so that they can give their authority to the beast to form some sort of alliance. That's the idea here. Whatever it means, whatever the details are, this is kind of what's happening, is that other nations of the world are joining in with this power, this central government there under the control of the beast. And the beast, of course, again, is someone who has done things and has that ability to get the world to marvel and just be drawn to them and to take them by take them, be influenced by him. So one thing I want to digress here for a little bit is just this: when we look at these multiple meanings, these two meanings given to the seven heads, we saw the seven heads represent the mountains and these kings, 7 kings. I think that's also, by the way, a hint in general on how to try to understand Revelation. We're looking for symbols, we're looking for meanings, but we don't want to get so locked into something that it can only mean this one thing. It's a literal nation or a literal this or literal that. I mean, even in this own thing here, you've got multiple meanings given to the exact same image. You've got the woman here, the harlot. She's in the wilderness. She's on the water. She's on the beast. She's on the mountains. I mean, if you get too caught up in every little thing, you're going to miss the actual point. So I think that's actually a good rule as a whole as we approach Revelation, to not get so caught up in some individual detail that we miss the larger picture of what God's trying to do for us here. It's just a little aside there. So we have the beast with the horns and the heads. We have the woman sitting upon the beast, and we have all that they represent. Kingdom of darkness, power from the abyss. That's the domains, if you will, of Satan. They have taken influence over the world, and through economic means, through cultural, faithless, religious means, even enticing the world into immorality and things that look good on the outside, but inside are in fact actually trouble. This is the way that Satan is attacking the world here. And by the way, if we were to look at our world today, not that this is brand new, but can we see a world today enticed by the idea of great wealth? Can we see a world enticed by the idea of great power? Again, those things aren't new. People have been enticed by those for as long as there's been stuff out there. But can we see a world enticed by that which looks good on the outside, but in fact is actually killing you otherwise? Of course we can. Can we see the increasing ability of ideas and philosophies to influence not just a region or an area, but the entire world? Of course we can. But let me ask you this, just for the sake of making you go, because I like to do that. What part of the world, what nation of the world has the most influence on the culture of the world right now? Think China? How many of y'all can name Chinese celebrities? If you go to Beijing right now, how many people can name LeBron James? I won't tell you right now. The nation that has the most influence on the culture of the world is the one we live in. The United States does China have enormous influence over a huge portion of the world? Absolutely. But culturally speaking, the last 60 or 70 years, the nation that you can go to anywhere in the world, they know you're American by looking at you, by how you talk. They know American culture. You can go there and they know American movies. How many of y'all, what's that? And the dollar, that nation is us. You don't go to South Africa or France or New York or Brazil and see Chinese basketball players or the Chinese yuan, which I think is that they're you see what? You see American dollars, you see American celebrities, you see American movies. Now, I just throw that out there for the fun of it. Whatever happens here at the end, the world exists in a place right now where where nations can't have influence. Individuals can have influence beyond their sphere, their immediate geographic sphere, in a way that you couldn't do in John's day, obviously. Whatever's going on, this type of influence is being waged. Now, these 10 kings now have joined with the beast for one purpose, to do what? Verse 14, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he's Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So they're there to make war. We saw that again at the end of 16. We saw this demonic sense there in verses 13 to 16. You have the beast, the Antichrist, the dragon, sending out, there's this idea of demonic influence where he's calling the kings, he's calling the nations together for the express purpose of resisting and fighting against God. So again, the same events described in the latter half of chapter 16 are being described right here. Verse 16, the 10 horns he saw, that beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and burn her up with fire. Now this verse just comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, this woman sitting on top of the beast, this Rome, Babylon, this culture, whatever you want to call it, this power influence over the world, who has aligned herself with the beast, the Antichrist, is now the object of what? She's the object of the Antichrist's anger. In fact, she is destroyed. The image here is of this. The harlot has betrayed and deserted and been faithless to God to ally herself with Satan. Because that's where it's fun, right? That's where you get the gold and the jewels and the lust of the flesh and all that type of stuff. And what happens to her ultimately at the end by who she has chosen to trust? She's destroyed by that which she chose to trust. Do you see the image? Now, that's the wisdom that God's trying to get us to see here. When we turn from God, because we have convinced ourselves that God's mean, He's got all those rules, He doesn't really love me, it's hard to follow God. I can't trust Him, I don't even believe in Him anymore. And I choose to do something different. And if you're ancient Israel, it's follow the gods of Egypt, follow the gods of Babylon, or follow the gods of Rome, or follow the gods of Canaan. It doesn't really matter who the gods are. You go and follow somebody else. You decide, if you're ancient Israel, well, instead of trusting the God who delivered us from Egypt, I'm going to pray to Baal for a good crop. Or instead of trusting God and following and worshiping Him, I'm going to sacrifice my child to Moloch. Or instead of following God, I'm going to trust the gods of Egypt or the gods of Babylon, because Babylon conquered us. Or if you're in the first century as a believer, I'm going to sacrifice and participate in the feast to whatever Roman god it may be out there so I can do business with the people who I do business with so I can survive. Whatever it is, when I choose what looks to be something really good in this world and choose to trust it instead of the God of creation, then that which I trust will ultimately turn around and destroy me. We're Genesis to Revelation. You go back to Genesis chapter 3. Eve sees the fruit on the tree, and do you remember what it says she thought? That looks good. She saw that it was pleasing to the eye and looked good to eat, so she took the fruit. That which looked good brought destruction. And one of the lessons that's here for us, I'm telling you, this chapter, while it is giving us wisdom on how to perceive the world of the end times, perhaps, it's also telling us, it's told us twice in chapter 13 and chapter here, I'm giving you some wisdom. Don't trust the temptations, the lure, the traps of that which looks good in this world. Don't trust those things, because otherwise you will be destroyed like the very things you're trusting. That which you think looks so good will destroy you. That's the wisdom here, by the way. Because if you are a saint, if you are one of those who are testifying to Christ in the middle of all this, what's the temptation? We're getting slaughtered. We can't buy food. All I got to do is just go with everybody else and trust the world system, trust this culture, trust that power, trust this, trust that, and I'll be okay. That's the temptation. And that's poison. The beast and the nations, these 10 kings, will turn on Rome. They'll turn on Babylon, destroy her. And that's part of God's plan there in verse 17. That's part of God has kind of planned that. That's part of the judgment on the harlot, on this world system, if you will. The woman you saw is the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. And God will, through, ironically, sin itself, destroy sin itself. And so we have seen here, chapter 17, the judgment on the harlot. Chapter 18, now we will see a lament over that, and we'll see it more described. Chapter 19, we will move our attention from that, and we'll begin looking at the bride of Christ. So there's chapter 17. We actually got the whole chapter again tonight. Look at that, 2 weeks in a row. If you've been watching with us online tonight, so grateful you've been with us. I want to invite you here Sunday morning. We got a great weekend coming up. The one-day missions event's taking place this weekend. We're going to see a lot of incredible things happen, and I know that this coming Sunday morning is just going to be a great time of celebration and Thanksgiving. So I want to invite you there for that. Sunday morning, 9:30, our core Bible study classes, and at 10:30, our worship. We're going to take some time to pray here. If you're at home, I hope you'll take some time to pray there. Y'all have a good evening. Good night. All right. Do we have some things? Obviously, one day happened.